So what we'll be talking about has to do with haiku specifically, but more the philosophy less specifically, and more kind of the state of consciousness of the interior mind in the larger sense. So haiku has been used for about 600 years to be a way of integrating oneself with the natural environment and with our own inner environment. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah. So this would be best approached from your perspective. If I were you, I would keep a real meditative state of mind. Don't listen to it like you're going to get a whole bunch of facts. You're going to be, you're like you're in a classroom or something. That you're just basically kind of absorbing it. I can see taking notes on certain things. There'll be some real abstract aspects that may be a little bit difficult to grasp right off, but and I'll give a lot of information, but none of it's really essential to understanding the whole approach that we're going to be going with you. So spiritual origins and the Zen nature of mind. So, or it could be the Zen mind of nature. Actually, I think I originally wrote it that way. So the idea is that nature and mind are the same thing. We just call it mind for the purposes of having something to differentiate it from, everything else that is going on around us. But we don't perceive anything in the world without our minds. Mind is necessary. Without a mind, you do not perceive the world. If you were in a coma, for example, you're not perceiving the world around you. So this mind sense, we kind of take it for granted. And we assume that the objective world out there is just all what it is, but it's only there by virtue of the mind that we have that's perceiving it. And that's through our senses, through our consciousness, through our feelings, through our intuitions, through our higher levels of consciousness, which we'll get into a little bit. So, and I know Jack will be talking about this in a couple of weeks, probably a lot more. So let's start in here. A little bit about haiku, first of all. Haiku is not a poem. It's not literature. It is a hand becoming, a door half opened, a mirror wiped clean. It is a way of returning to nature, to our moon nature, our cherry blossom nature, our falling leaf nature, in short, our Buddha nature. It is a way in which the cold winter rain, which we're experiencing right now, the swallows of evening, even the way in its hotness and the length of the night, become truly alive, share in our humanity, speak their own silent and expressive language. So this is from a series of books that we'll be talking a lot about. This is one, I've got all 4 volumes here, but it was written in 1949 and was very influential in the San Francisco beat scene, and kind of an explosion of sort of the whole beat culture, beatniks and all of that, which then kind of morphed into the hippie culture. And it was sort of a way that Eastern philosophy first made its inroads in a big way to the popular culture. Obviously, the Theosophical Society introduced some of these ideas, 100 and some odd years earlier than that, or well, at that time, yeah. So 1875 or so. So, but in terms of really making an impact on culture, this was one of the big things that really informed the culture of the 1950s in San Francisco and New York specifically. So we're going to be having a little immersion into Japanese culture of this era. There's a poet looking at cherry blossoms. So this is this dude named Chandru who wrote this a few months ago. Woke up this morning thinking about how the haiku guys were right, organizing the world according to the seasons, i.e. the various appearances of the sun, moon and sky, trees and birds. It is also logical, integrating our lives to these rhythms, feeling the freshness of the wind, the emergence of certain plants, the movement of animals, the calm lake or the raging sea, the clear sky or the sunlit clouds. Why are we struck with awe by certain appearances of nature, rainbows, the full moon, the sunlit tops of mountains at dawn or dusk, the stars on a clear night, or the moon peeking through the clouds? Drops of dew on delicate petals, or a shimmering ethereal spiderweb with its brilliant creator hovering in the breeze, observing the passing world. So here's the books that I'm going to be referring to. The first part of this will go for about 15, 20 minutes talking about this. This is to show how haiku made its first impact in the West through these books here, and kind of give you a little flavor of how that then translated into the Westerners who are reading this, and how it informed their art, how it informed their poetry. And so these are the beats. It's a few of the many. And I don't know how many people know about the beat culture and all that sort of thing. And it's not super important. We'll be introducing some of these characters, but they were very influential in the poetic scene in San Francisco and New York in the mid-50s and mid-1950s. There's three of them that were in the last picture: Philip Whalen, Wendy Waldman,
and Waldman.
And you're right. Thank you. Yeah, boy, I can't pull anything over on. We have a knowledgeable crowd here. I don't know how I got Wendy. It's Ann Waldman. Absolutely. A-N-N-E. So anyway, this is, you can see Allen Ginsberg holding forth. This must have been a presentation they were doing. They're all look fairly young there. So probably, I'd guess around 1960, something like that. So the first one we'll be talking about is Jack Kerouac. And Jack Kerouac was the fellow who wrote The Dharma Bums and On the Road. It's a very famous novel. And then Dharma Bums after that. And he's describing traveling back and forth across the country and hitchhiking, riding freight trains, and by what means whatever, without any money, just like stopping and doing odd jobs and so forth to get enough money to eat. And, very creative, and it was very swept the country by storm. This whole idea for young people, particularly after World War II, soldiers coming back from the war, young people, men and women, were very entranced with this idea of this kind of a nomadic life, and so a lot of it had to do with going back to Chinese poets in the Tang Dynasty, particularly, but then in that kind of filtered into Japan, and the Japanese poets, who were pretty. They were kind of like this themselves. They would wander around, and they didn't. The whole idea of the Zen monastery and all that wasn't at this time. Was just kind of starting. So Zen, as it was practiced in those days, was really just wandering around, going to different teachers and so forth. And so this lifestyle really worked well for these folks. And so here's what Jack Kerouac wrote about haiku. Above all, a haiku must be very simple and free of all poetic trickery, and make a little picture, and yet be as airy and graceful as a Vivaldi pastorella. So this is the book Dharma Bums that he wrote. And I can read this better. Figure out how to do these pictures. The Dharma Bums is a 1956, is it? 50, it's in the 50s. Written by the Beat Generation author Jack Kerouac. The basis of the novel, semi-fictional accounts of the events occurring in the years after the events of On the Road. It was the year before. The main characters are the narrator Ray Smith, based on Kerouac, and Jaffe Ryder, based on the poet and essayist Gary Snyder, who was instrumental in Kerouac's introduction to Buddhism in the 1950s. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so here's an excerpt. This will kind of get you into the scene there and what we're talking about. This is an excerpt from the Dharma Bums. Anyway, I followed the whole gang of howling poets to the reading at Gallery 6 that night, which was, among other important things, the night of the birth of the San Francisco Poetry Renaissance. Everyone was there. It was a mad night, and I was the one who got things jumping by going around and collecting dimes and quarters from the rather stiff audience standing around in the gallery, and coming back with 3 huge gallon jugs of California Burgundy and getting them all piffed, so that by 11 o'clock, when Alva Goldbook, who's actually Allen Ginsberg, was reading his poem, Whale, which is actually called Howl, drunk with the arms outspread and everybody yelling, go, 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 like a jam session. And old Reinhold Calcioettis, the father of the Frisco poetry, was there wiping his tears in gladness. So this is this whole idea that, you think about beatniks and all of this. This is where this all started, 1950s, and they were often reading from the Chinese poets. Here's some haiku from Jack Kerouac. Following each other, my cat stops when it thunders. Alone in old clothes, sipping wine beneath the moon. Looking for my cat in the weeds, I found a butterfly. April mist under the pine at midnight. So you see, they're very simple, as he said, not ornate, but creating a picture, a little kind of vignette in your mind. Mariana had mentioned that it's good to go really slow and not try to overwhelm people, because these are all going to kind of fly by. You're going to see about 100 haiku here, but they're all really short. So they're kind of like little images, like little flashes, like how you do these videos where they can have these little images. So, and then they can also go you can also go very deeply into any given one. So anyway, these are Western haikus. Now here's Gary Snyder, and he's the person who's kind of the hero of the Dharma Bums. He's actually a very deep Chinese scholar. He would translate Chinese poems, got very interested. He grew up in Oregon. His father was a logger, and he grew up in logging camps up in Oregon, and then he came down to San Francisco. So he is very important in terms of what all happened with this whole scene, because he was kind of like the really authentic thread. The rest of them were all kind of grooving on it, but he was one that had actually gone into the original Chinese poems and Japanese as well. So he says, I have never called my brief poems haiku, except in certain rare cases where a brief poem met what I felt were the key aesthetic requirements of a top quality haiku, which means, among other things, freedom from ego. I do not think we should even think haiku in other languages and cultures. We should think brief or short poems. I don't think counting 575 syllables is necessary or desirable. To reflect the natural world and the season is to reflect what is. Many modern haiku don't even have a kigo or season word. So we'll talk about some characteristics of haiku when we get through this section here, but these folks are already starting to refer to things that I think are really important to understand the real essence of haiku, which is not just some little game, some little word game, which it often is represented when it's taught in classrooms and so forth. Send some haiku. I think I'm going to skip this just because we've got a lot of time. Let's see, I'll just grab one there. Wild horses on the hill, grazes on eucalyptus, naps under shade tree. So they're just images, nature, really vivid images you can see as you scan this yourself. Each one of them has real potent impact. Just little snapshots of the world. Okay, Allen Ginsberg. He's a real gone cat, and he's probably the most famous of all the more well known than the rest of them. So here's his thoughts on haiku. Allen also told us that formal 5 syllables, then 7, then 5, often taught in Western schools, does not necessarily work in English. In Japanese, each syllable counts. They don't have the, and, that, those articles of speech. So he encouraged us not to worry about the count if we write or translate haiku. Only make sure that the 3 lines make the mind leap. The only measure of a haiku, he told us that one hot July afternoon, is upon hearing one, your mind experiences a small sensation of space. He paused. I leaned in, breathless, which is nothing less than God. Now, he wrote this is his idea of how you would take this. And I'm just going to let you scan those. And you can kind of just see how, again, this is, if you kind of, sort of picture a smoky cafe with bongo drums, and, people running around in berets and black turtleneck sweater shirts and skinny jeans. You'd have this kind of scene where you just have this kind of percussive, short little kind of flashes. Rainy night on Union Square, full moon. Want more poems? Wait till I'm dead. That kind of stuff. So he's I don't know, the bearded robots drinking from uranium coffee cups on Saturn's ring. So they're very imaginative. Let's put it that way. All right, here is Anne Waldman.
Yep.
Hey, not Wendy, not her sister Wendy. I don't know if there's Wendy. So anyway, it's too bad that Ansel's not here because there's a lot of connection between what became the Europa Institute, and he's taking classes there now. But she was a director there at the Naropa Institute, as you can see by what's written down there below, signed by Allen Ginsberg. So she was another one of the people who was very deeply involved in that scene. And here's what she wrote. This is really pretty. And it's not really a haiku as such, but each kind of line is like a haiku. And so you kind of see it that way. It's just a kind of way of organizing the world. Light and shadow, the shadow the gull makes, the crow, the eagle, the lightning glistening on wet seals playing on the San Francisco coast. The shadows furniture makes in the living rooms all across the world. The shadows huts make, the light absorbed into clothes. The women in South America beating their clothes against the rocks and drying them in the sun. Sitting down in shadow, the cool shadows of water. Fish illuminated, their colors brilliant in the glittering light through the clear sea, darting in and out of the light and shadow, shadow from the tender water plants, swaying in the tender light and shadow. I personally think that's really beautiful. The way the words go back and forth, you can appreciate the art of that, the way she works light and shadow, keeps going back in and out. And you have this kind of sort of vision of moving through the poem. Now, I'm not going to, by the way, I'm not going to do a lot of analysis of the poems. I'm going to let them speak for themselves. I just this one really blows my mind. So Philip Whalen ended up becoming, the guy on the left, ended up becoming a Zen priest and spent most of his life in Zen. and was also involved with the Naropa Institute. There he is with Jack Kerouac, who was the author we talked about earlier. So he wrote, if you're so smart, why ain't you rich? I need everything else, anything else desperately, but I have nothing. Shall have nothing but this, immediate, inescapable, and invaluable. No one can afford this, being made here and now.
Wrote it in Seattle.
Seattle, Washington, 17 May 1955. Okay, and the last poet we're going to talk about is Diane de Prima. And she was actually the one that had the longest and probably most influential over time. She was also involved with the Naropa Institute and did a lot of stuff. Throughout her life, she continued to write and tremendous poetry. Highly recommend checking her out. You are my bread, the hairline, noise of my bones. You are almost the sea. You are not stone or molten sound. I think you have no hands. This kind of bird flies backward, and this love breaks on a window pane where no light talks. This is not time for crossing tongues. The sand here never shifts. I think tomorrow turns you with its toe, and you will shine and shine, unspent and underground. So now we're going to shift gears. And now we're going to get into haiku proper. First of all, giving a little Western view of poetry and the Western way of seeing things. So Tennyson wrote, flowered in the crannied wall, I pick you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all, and all, and all, I should know what God and man is. Do you see something a little bit funny about that? Pulling a flower out of the wall to try to understand it. And this is kind of the way that we do in the West. We separate things out, we analyze them. We don't see things within the whole context. It's the opposite of what the Zen and haiku poet does, where you see the whole world as it is, not one little aspect pulling out. You always see it within context. So this is actually mentioned in the book by Blyth. He mentions this, and I thought it was really apropos, just to kind of make us realize this as we're going along, that we're tending to have the holistic view of things, not necessarily analyzing each thing as it's coming along. We try to understand things this way, and it just makes our head hurt. Instead of trying to really block it in a larger sense, we're always pulling little elements out of the world and thinking we can assemble them all and make it into some kind of coherent world, and it's not. It's just a little shot here, a little shot there, and it doesn't really fit together in a cohesive whole. So here are some attributes of Zen. The state of mind for haiku. These are aspects that will come up in haiku. Selflessness, loneliness, grateful acceptance, wordlessness, non-intellectuality, contradiction, humor, freedom, non-morality, simplicity, materiality, love, and courage. And I thought of doing each one of these, but I thought that would be kind of boring after a while. So I just pulled out, I think I pulled out 6 of these with haikus that kind of show them, kind of show how it could be that. I think for any given haiku, you could probably put 3 or 4 of these attributes, or 5, or almost all of them. But the idea is that we're trying to get some idea of the nuance, or the flavor of the emotion of haiku. not just a cute little word poem, word game. Selflessness. Myself of long ago in nature, non-existent. No final destination. Nothing of any value. Myself of long ago. Oops. So the Concadori is a bird that lives amongst the mountains far away from the haunts of men. So its very shape and form are almost unknown. Its voice is somewhat like a wood dove and is always heard in the distance. It is said by its voice to announce the coming of rain and the coming of a cessation, the beginning and end of rain. So Basho, we'll meet in a minute, wrote, Concadori, deepen thou my loneliness. So the poet hears this bird, which people don't even see, because it's so away from humans. And so it gives the sense of loneliness as it's hearing the sound of the bird in the forest, the deep forest. So I love this particular thing. I remember when I was reading this to you, I started crying. It's exciting. So Tokusan was sitting outside doing zazen. Ryotan, his wife, asked him why he didn't go back home. Tokusan said, because it is dark. Ryotan lit a candle and handed it to him. When Tokusan was about to take it, Ryotan blew it out. Tokusan prostrated before her.
It takes a long pause to sink in.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I hate to explain it. It's just, to me, the whole sensitivity and the subtleness of it is just there's a lot going on there, a lot unseen. It's a relationships nowadays. People always complaining about somebody doesn't clean up the bathroom or whatever. And it's like this sensitivity and relating to each other in a relationship, that it would be that deep, that this sort of interaction would be possible. It's just, to me, it's just amazing. I don't know how other people feel about it. Wordlessness. They spoke no word. The visitor, the host, and the white chrysanthemum. Now I'm adding little images here, mostly from Japanese art, but in a certain sense, this probably would be better if I didn't, but you can always go back and read these yourself. Non-intellectuality. How admirable he who thinks not. Life is fleeting when he sees the lightning. So this whole idea of non-intellectuality is very important. Not thinking about things, not thinking, trying to find meaning in things, and just letting things be what they are. I have Mondo at the bottom because this is, so in Zen monasteries, they have a tradition where they meditate for ungodly lengths of time. And then when they finish, they get the chance to go to see the head of the monastery and talk to him. Each meditant gets to go in and have an interview. And so that kind of confirms his understanding of what's going on. And so one Western meditant had been going to the monastery for a long time, and he had just time after time, he'd go in and have the interview with the teacher, and the teacher was saying that. And he was getting desperate. So he had this idea. This would be really cool. this will really get the Roshi really. He'll see how I've really gotten it. And so he saw a bullfrog in the road, and so he grabbed the bullfrog and put it in his kimono and went into the interview and just sat there. And then says, "Do you have anything to show me?" And he didn't say a word. He just pulled out the bullfrog and showed it to the Roshi. And the Roshi said, "Too intellectual." So it doesn't seem intellectual to Westerners, but to Easterners, that'd be very intellectual. Okay, freedom. I think this speaks for itself. Simply trust. Do not the petals flutter down just like that? I love this. Simplicity. The full moon, only lovely, flawlessly clear. Moon gazing, looking at it, it clouds over. Not looking, it becomes clear. You see the simplicity of that, right? So we'll talk a little bit about Matsuo Basho, and he's the basically inventor of haiku. I've given talks where I talked the whole thing was about his life for an hour and a half, and I'm not going to do that today because I got to keep an eye on the time here. So, but he was born in Japan, which you can read all of his stuff there. But the main thing is that he was famous for doing something in Japan. They had what's called link poetry. It came from China, and this idea that poets would sit around in a circle. You'd have 2, 3, 4 poets sit around in a circle, and one would start a stanza, and then from then on, the person would take usually the last line of the stanza that they've been given, and that would be the first line of the next stanza. And they'd make these linked poems. So they'd have this series of poems that would just go like this down, and they would be, they could be really long, 100 stanzas or shorter. So what Basho did was take the idea of the hoku, which is the first stanza. It's the keynote stanza, because however the poem starts is going to be what's going to basically going to be the, if it starts in a fish market, in the evening in winter, then that's where you're going to start out. It might end up, on the beach in the summer, but it's going to do it gradually. So anyway, the hoku is very important. It kind of sets the tone for the poem. And so what Basho saw was these hoku were really powerful. So why not just write those, And so as you see there, he's the master of the haiku, then called hoku. Hoku became haiku, and haiku has a sense of kind of playfulness about it. But the idea is that you're just going to take this first stanza of a poem and make it your poem. And so this is really boiling it down to its essence, which is a very Zen thing to do. So here's the most famous haikus I've been told, or pretty much every author says this. In Japan, all the kids learn this particular haiku, which is the old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. And so the scene is an old pond in the forest. Imagine some rocks or whatever, moss, trees hanging down, limpid water. And the poet's there in this deep meditation, and all of a sudden he hears in the water. And so he realizes the frog has jumped in. So the frog has kind of entered his tranquility, his silence, his quiet mind. And so it's this idea of the frog jumping in. Now, this is very subtle in Western, for a Westerner. This seems a little bit too subtle, but for somebody in Zen, this is like the height. This is it. This is this is as good as it gets. So you can see if you're not kind of getting why this is cool, then you can see what the issue is here. So we're going to talk a little bit about this poem. As you can see, there's the Japanese. And then there is the literal translation at the bottom, old pond frog. jumps in water's sound. So that's literally what these words mean in Japanese, and then it gets translated into the old pond, a frog jumps in, and then the sound of water, or you could just say splash or plop or whatever. Actually, last time I did this, there was like 100 frogs. It was called 100 Frogs, and somebody had taken all these different translations of this particular poem, including having Basho jumping in the water and things like that. So here is the, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because this is something that people always hear about. The haiku has the 575 thing, right? Everybody knows that, 575. That's the big deal with haiku. That's what makes it special. And yet, I see here, the old pond, that's 3. A frog jumps in, that's 4, or if we put the dash, that might be 5. The sound of water, that's 5. What are you talking about? So first of all, remember that we're translating from Japanese. And so in Japanese, they have what they call mora. Mora actually happens in a lot of languages, but it's a whole different setup than in English. So you have these short, kind of percussive like beats, like boom, 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 like do, 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 do. Do, 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 like that. So you have this kind of, and when we write haiku, or we try to write haiku, we don't think in those terms. And so it's important to realize that this is actually like a beat, like a rhythmic beat. So furu iki ya, kawazu tobi komu, mizo no oto. So it's this, which is really important for the Japanese that are reading it. It's probably not so important for us to understand it, but I just thought I'd throw that in so you understand this whole idea about the beats and the syllables and all that. The syllable thing doesn't really work out, as we saw in, I think it was Kerouac talked about. It's not really that big of a deal. I think the brevity is important. 3 lines I think is great. The idea of pulling in different elements of nature and then kind of putting them together and seeing how they kind of glue together to make sort of a splash in our consciousness. So anyway, just I thought I'd give you that's a little technical stuff. So we're going to do a few haiku here, and you can see, I'll talk about the ones that, actually I'll give a little brief description of each one as we go along, just so that you kind of get the idea. So this first one is, now, as soon as eyes of the hawk too darken, quail chirp. And so when we read that, we go, what the heck is, what's this all about? So, but the idea is that right when it gets nighttime, if you're not really tuned into nature, you don't realize what changes with nighttime, but all different kinds of species come out at night that are out during the day. So hawks have really good eyes during the day, right? And they can see forever. But when it's night, they can't see a thing. So then the birds of prey, the birds that get preyed on, then they feel a little bit more free. And so this idea of the quail chirping now, because the hawk can't see them. So that's what's going on there with that poem. It's just kind of shifting your mind and thinking about from the quail's point of view in this case. Absolutely, I love this illustration. Okay, now here's a very famous basho. These are all by Basho, by the way. On a withered branch, a crow is perched, an autumn evening. So again, not a lot of action going on here, right? Look at the line by line translation, the word by word at the bottom. Withered branch on, crow of perched, autumn of evening. It's a different way that the word syntax works in Japanese, and you could miss the fact that when it gets translated as the crow gets perched, it's actually saying something more about the perchedness of the crow. that the crow is in kind of the state of perchness, as opposed to the way we would normally think of it when we think of perching. So there's this whole kind of sort of sense of presence that occurs in Japanese. It makes this haiku more remarkable than its translation would necessarily make you think. On a withered branch, a crow is perched in autumn evening. Autumn evening happens a lot. There's in haiku, Schneider talked about season words. And so that often happens in haiku. In the linked poems that haiku comes from, there would be season words expected at a certain stanza, like maybe 20 or 35 or something. You would need to know what season it was, or you'd need to know it's a full moon, or you'd need to know, cherry blossoms or whatever. Something that shows, that signifies what's going on in nature, kind of like a little timer going on. And so you often see autumn evening or spring morning or spring evening, all these different things. So, okay, this is a very poignant haiku. While the world is a dewdrop, while the dewdrop world is a dewdrop, yet. So this poem was written by Isa. Actually, this isn't Basho. This is Isa. It was written after his daughter had died at 2 years old, and he's talking about this idea that we can say it's all changing, it's all this, but there's kind of this and yet this idea that I get it, but and this is kind of that sound. So I guess again, it's kind of one of those things you either get or you don't, but I find that very powerful, this one here. I have a hunch that this is what is written in, it's probably Japanese for the same poem. This was what Basho wrote just before he died. He traveled, he loved traveling, and that was his whole life, traveling around. And so I am resolved to bleach on the moors, my body is pierced by the wind. So it's a very romantic kind of sentiment of being on the traveling, and just kind of, as you see your bones there bleaching in the sun or whatever, in the wind. And here's one, we talked about loneliness or solitude, that sort of thing. This road with no one going, autumn evening. And you think of a lonely road. Autumn evening is getting dark. Now this picture that doesn't really show it, but just kind of get in your mind the idea of this loneliness in autumn evening, nobody on the road. Evocative. Let's see. Autumn deepens. My neighbor, what does he do? So there's sort of a sense of relationship, a sense of connection with others, a sense of humanity. A flash of lightning, through the darkness goes the scream of the night heron. So here, imagine the poet, and it's lightning flashes overhead, and then you hear the bird screaming, in shock from the thing. It's just kind of the sense of really nature just coming really, really in your face, and how startling that would be, and how powerful it would be, potentially powerful. I love this one. With what voice and what song do you sing, spider? Autumn wind. This is the sensitivity of the poet. Thinking of the little spider, in the spider web, in the breeze, blowing back and forth. Thinking of that, how powerful that sense of connection with nature can be. We just see a spider web and we try to knock them out of the way or whatever, but thinking of this amazing being that's actually floating in the wind. So this, we're going to talk about this particular poem a bit. This is going to, we're talking here about translation. So the original poem is "The cry of the cuckoo goes slanting across the water." And so there would be a word in Japanese that kind of give this off sound. And it kind of gives it emphasis. So the cry of the cuckoo goes slanting across the water. The cry itself, right? It's not the cuckoo. It's the cry of the cuckoo goes slanting across the water. So this gets translated in a number of different ways. It's a little bit tricky, right? So this is the original translation. This is supposed to be the best translation according to the author. By the way, this is from this book called A Zen Way, which you guys there can't see it, I guess. But anyway, I don't know if my face is on there. Is it? Am I there?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. So it's by Robert Aitken, and he talks about this in this book, these translation issues. So anyway, here's the cry of the cuckoo goes slanting across the water. So we get this idea. And the idea of the voice slanting is really interesting. So it's kind of a cool little nuance you wouldn't think of. You wouldn't think of a voice of a bird slanting. It's kind of a cool idea. So anyway, so then the next translation, which he doesn't quite like quite so much. So here's the cuckoo, the hototo gisu, or the cuckoo, casting a thread of sound over the water. Now, now wait a minute. The original poem didn't say anything about a thread of sound. It's kind of nice though. It's kind of cool. I kind of like it. I kind of like that thread of sound. That's kind of different. But just to see, okay, wait a minute. We did something a little different than the original poem said, right? Okay, so then the next one, a lot of stuff starts happening that wasn't in the original poem. As the cuckoo flies, its singing stretches out, across the water lies. All right, now you see the you see the word by word above, cuckoo's voice slanting over the water. And now all of a sudden the cuckoo's flying, which she wasn't doing originally necessarily. Its singing is now stretching out and lying across the water. And so you see how the translation, now the reason why this particular poet thought that the haiku needed to rhyme, so he puts in flies and lies there. And almost invariably when somebody tries to rhyme the old haiku, it really doesn't work. Because you have to force it too much to make it, in this case. Okay, now here's his worst example. The voice of the hototo gisu drops to the lake where it lay floating on the surface. It's like, poor voice. It's floating. It's like a dead voice floating on the surface. This is like, it sounds like kind of romantic or poetic or something like that. But it's like, really? It's not really doing that. So this is just showing how you can read translations and they can go way off in different directions than the original intention of the author. Let's see, what's this? Oh, yeah, this is the cuckoo, by the way. And I just pulled this off of, as you can tell off of Wikipedia. I thought it was cool at the bottom though. It says, the cuckoo represents the sound of sadness. So, I guess in Korea, if you hear this particular bird, it makes you sad. Anyway. So, and then along the same lines, and maybe in the interest of time, we won't spend too much time with this, but this is probably my favorite haiku. The sea darkens, a wild duck's call, faintly white. And so I just think this is really beautiful and evocative. And sometimes it'll just go through my mind, just really catches me. Think of it every so often. So there's a lot of different ways you can translate. this. You see, you have darkening waves where the sea darkens. You have the water fading down there, you see. Slowly the sea darkens, and so forth. Likewise with the ducks, you can have multiple ducks, you can have one duck, you can have the duck crying, you can have it calling, you can have its plaintive cry, you can have its voice. So the duck can be doing all different kinds of things, you know, different, expressing itself in different ways. Now the faintly white stays pretty consistent. So the one that was interesting, Mariana noticed this when we were going over this. It's this Hamill, Sam Hamill, who's actually a really well-known Western translator, but seas slowly darken and the wild duck's plaintive cry grows faintly white. So he's put a lot of kind of more verbs in there than in descriptions than it was in the original poem. Which is nice. I mean, it kind of, you know, the slowly darkening, the plaintive cry, you know, this is all really nice, but it's not really what's there. And it kind of like is telling the reader more than, or the listener more than necessarily needs to know. You know, let the poem speak for itself. And so forth and so on. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time, and now I'm spending a lot of time. So anyway, just to kind of show you, you know, the translation is really important. And so I just like this one. I think this is the last one of the series. So an evening breeze, the water laps against the heron's legs. So I mean, I've got the picture here, so it's kind of like, you know, it sort of takes away a little bit from the evocativeness of it. But if you think of the water and the breeze, you know, and all of this kind of moving together, and there's the heron kind of pulling it all together, you know, this heron there. This idea of nature moving around. It's not, the heron is not separate from the world. It's sitting in the water, it's got the breeze going against it. There's just this idea of how nature's, everything's connected. This, to me, that's very evocative. So we'll finish with a Saikontan. And Saikontan is not haiku per se, but it's it came from China, and it has informed those poets to a large extent. And so these are easier to understand what's going on, but they're not as terse as haiku. But I think they give more of the flavor of the kind of the sentiment of the poet and Zen in general. So, water not disturbed by waves settles down of itself. A mirror not covered with dust is bright and clear. The mind should be like this. Is this me? Oh, there's lovely. That was lovely.
Can you start?
We had a little inside. We had a little concert here. Water not disturbed by waves settles down by itself, of itself. A mirror not covered with dust is bright and clear. The mind should be like this. When what beclouds it passes away, its brightness appears. Happiness must not be sought for. When what disturbs passes away, happiness appears of itself.
That was a beautiful illustration on that, by the way.
Yeah.
How mind settles down on itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't. I like this.
One thing I really appreciate about that is, I think with haiku.
So let's finish.
Okay.
Hang on, because they can't hear you.
Okay.
That's the only reason why I
Oh,
don't.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to sound odd to them. So we're almost finished here, and then I would love to hear what Jeanette had to say about this. So another one, an ancient worthy says, worthy is like somebody's. An ancient worthy says, the shadow of the bamboo sweeps over the stairs, but the dust does not move. The disk of the moon passes through the water of the lake, leaving no trace. One of our Confucians say, The stream rushes down swiftly, but all is silent around. The flowers fall incessantly, but we feel quiet. If you have grasped the meaning of this in all of your relations with things, you are free in mind and body. When in the mood, I take off my shoes and walk barefooted through the sweet-smelling grasses of the field. Wild birds, without fear, accompanying me. My heart at one with nature, I loosen my shirt. As I sit absorbed beneath the falling petals, while the clouds silently enfold me, as if wishing to keep me there. Just as a whirlwind roaring down a valley leaves nothing behind it, so the ear is to have nothing to do with right and wrong. Just as the moon only reflects its light in a pool, so the mind, empty and unattached, does not know itself and the outside world as two things. Okay, and this is it. So this is from Alan Watts. Alan Watts is fantastic interpreters, and he was actually hung out with those guys in San Francisco. He's in the Dharma Bums mentioned. So, but again, and for the last time, let me say that you must not look here for any symbolism. We were just talking about this morning about symbolism. This is right to your point, Jeanette. An idea either of God revealed in the beauty of the autumn leaves, or just autumn leaves with no God, or the transiency of life, or of anything else. The mysterious and yet obvious thusness of things is clear when you see it directly without asking any questions. Gensha, another old Zen master, was asked how to enter the path of Buddhism. He answered, "Do you hear the stream? Why, yes. There," he concluded, "is the way to enter." And the poet Gochiko put it quite properly in a haiku. "The long night, the sound of water says what I think." The end.